background noise is going to be interesting here for a few minutes, so please bear with us. We're going to get going.
Grab some popcorn.
We both have an in-person at the Frenchtown Junior High Commons, as well as this Zoom meeting. My name is Brian Campbell. I am going to try and facilitate this interesting meeting tonight. It is with Smurfit-Stone Community Advisory Group. Our mission statement is to serve as a trusted liaison between the community, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. By becoming informed, sharing this information with the public, and engaging in the Superfund process to ensure the restoration of the former Smurfit-Stone mill site is to a healthy ecological state for future generations. So with that, I would ask a little housekeeping. One, if y'all would mute, and it looks like folks are doing a really good job of that. While we're talking, I will do what I can to mute the background here while we have presenters and keep the background noise. There is a volleyball game going and folks are wandering through. So with that, the review of last month's meeting. If there are any additions or deletions or comments, I'll take them right now. There is one change in the minutes. We have Bruce and Jen and EPA are going to discuss the highlights of what is said to be September 23rd meeting and it's actually August 23rd meeting. Those are the only changes that I see in last month's meeting minutes. So with that, we have speakers tonight, Bruce Sims, Jen Harrington, and the EPA, and I don't know who is representing the EPA today. We'll discuss the highlights of the September 23rd, pardon me, the August 23rd meeting with Casey Baker, Region 8 EPA Administrator. And then we're going to have a speaker, Andrew Wilcox. We'll talk about channel migration and climate impacts on the Clark Fork Basin. And then EPA will have an update on the Smurfit-Stone site activities. And then we'll go into the general agenda items for next month. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Bruce Sims and let him go ahead with the start of the discussion.
Yes.
And Andrew Wilcox, I didn't see you up.
He's here.
He's right behind me, so I guess he's not on. All right, here we go, folks. Bruce Sims.
And is Jen Harrington on board as well?
Yes, Bruce, I'm here.
Okay, Jen, I'll start out if you'd like and just talk briefly about the meeting we had with the EPA. Casey Becker, who's the regional administrator, and a few of her staff met with us last week, and we had pretty frank discussions. We brought up several what we thought were pretty critical holes in the process. We still feel that the density of soil sampling and actually the study design for soil sampling isn't adequate to really understand where priority areas might be for restoration work. And we also read a 2017 memo where a former employee stated that he had buried 60 drums of transformer oil at the mill site, and we wondered why we had never approved or disproved that statement. And let's see, what else did we talk about, Jen? You want to go from there?
Well, I think some of the important outcomes of the meeting with Casey Becker were that she identified the community, the stakeholder concerns fairly well, and suggested to the project manager that perhaps the process as it has been going is not working. And Casey Becker, requested that if we do wish to, if we want to identify the gaps or holes in the current sampling plan and or remedial investigation plan, that she wanted to have some of our input within a month, which I thought was a really important opportunity for us. And I know Elena has been already spearheading this effort to gather the priorities in those gaps.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I do think that the Casey Becker actually recognized that we've been giving principally the same input for years now and getting the same answers back, which we all felt were unsatisfactory, weren't really answering the concerns we had. And I think that was good. I think that was a good finding for the meeting, a good end finding. We also talked a little bit about potential for flooding at the site and how the berm study probably was inadequate to really address the potential for flooding and what we've seen lately in the region with the atmospheric rivers and the tremendous floods, 3 in a row now, northwestern Oregon, southeastern Washington, British Columbia a year ago, and now Yellowstone. All 3 of these atmospheric rivers that come out of the tropics with tremendous amounts of moisture, and they've kind of bracketed now our region and the Clark Fork watershed, and there's no guarantee that couldn't happen any year to us, just as it has to neighboring areas. Anything else you can think, Jen, that we've missed?
I have a quick question. Did
Oh,
she, is she coming back soonish for a float trip? Did that get discussed at all?
I think that's the plan,
Okay,
but I don't think it was formalized yet.
okay.
Yeah.
Are we doing that? Is Dana doing that? Where did that land, Jen? Do you know?
I actually think it is in our lap that
Okay.
we need to organize that.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Clark Fork Coalition will help us arrange that, and Elena and Peter said that he'd be part of that too. A float trip with Casey Becker, hopefully this fallish.
Oh, yeah, no, I think there's a lot of concerns about liability when it comes to, we tried really hard to get her on a raft with at least a commissioner and maybe other people, but it fell apart, unfortunately, kind of, at the last minute. So, I think there's other ideas going around that I hope we can have a community float past the site. I think there's a large difference when you actually see the berms in person, when you see or try to stand under the high water mark on the banks and you slide down, just how unstable they are. And so, Andrew and this whole group has talked, and we're going to make that happen. Given where we are in the year, we'll do it next year, and we'll be sure to, or next summer, and we'll be sure to invite everybody who's interested.
Okay, are there any other comments from that meeting with the regional administrator?
Yeah, I think just if anybody has any other high priority sampling, I know most people have already submitted everything in comments, but if you could pull out your comments and just put them in an email to me, we're gonna prioritize those and get those to Casey Becker and her staff.
Great, thank you.
All right, I'm back. Did this work out okay for everybody? Did you understand and hear everybody speak in that last presentation? Sounds good to me. All right, we have another. Oh, thank you. All right, what we're going to have to do now is plug a flash drive into this computer and see if we can get the presentation working. Andrew Wilcox is from the University of Montana geodesic facility, and his talk is on channel migration and the climate impacts to the Clark Fork Basin. So I think both of them are pretty important. Once again, thank you, Brian. We're going to share this.
We're not going to, we're going to try. I'm not making any promises yet.
All right, you lost me. So can you still hear
You're
me?
still there.
Okay. It'll take a couple of seconds to get this loaded, ready to go. The meeting will go at least till 7, if not 7:30. If you guys have any agenda topics, write them down. We'll be ready to take them after this presentation with Mr. Wilcox. So stand by.
Similar to the adjustment period of moving online, we're again adjusting to in person. It's just the opposite.
All right,
Hybrid is always the
are we sharing?
If you're doing it all online, we mark systems down. If you're in person,
Yes.
trying to do both.
All right, Dave, we got, all right, thanks, Dave.
In person in a couple of years.
Okay,
Wow.
so here we go.
It's really.
This is Andrew Wilcox, Department of Geodesics, if I got that right. University of Montana.
All yours, sir. Just your screen.
Hello, everyone on Zoom and everyone here in the room. Thanks for having me. So I'm from the Department of Geosciences at the University of Montana. And Geodesy is part of that. But I'm a geomorphologist and I mainly work on river processes. And I don't have a long kind of presentation tonight. There's obviously a lot of potential ground to cover, and I wasn't quite sure what.
Excuse me, somebody muted the computer. Just see lips moving. There you go.
All right.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
You hear me okay? Feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. I don't have a I gotta get through certain content. I have various things to talk about, but I want to sort of follow your interests and present and talk about what's useful to you all. So I'll just briefly introduce myself first. I've been on the faculty at University of Montana for 15 years in the Department of Geosciences, and I study landscapes and the processes that shape them. I mainly work on rivers. I'm also very interested in energy systems more broadly. During my time at I've had some fantastic undergraduate and graduate students, such as Elena Evans, who I've been fortunate to work with, and it's really wonderful to see those folks sort of out in the community and working on rivers and water issues. I am also recently returned from a year in Washington, D.C., where I mixed things up in a major way by going to work at the U.S. Department of State as a visiting science fellow, mostly working on issues related to energy and minerals for electric vehicle batteries. Tried to work in fluvial geomorphology wherever possible, but that's not a big thing in the State Department, as you might imagine. So I like to start pretty much any talk, regardless of the topic, of just big picture context. Rivers are at the heart of energy, water, and food systems, and that they are at the heart of a lot of really wicked problems facing our society in the future. So a few plots to sort of illustrate that. First, we have where we get our electricity globally. And for those of you who are in the room, you're absolutely welcome to come around and look at the screen since we don't have the smart board working. But what we're seeing here is a plot of the last kind of 30 years or so of electricity generation. And there's a blue line there that is how much electricity we get globally from hydroelectric power. And that's about 16% globally, higher in some places like Montana, a little bit lower as a national average in the US. So, of course, that's a prime example of connections between rivers and energy systems and how what happens in rivers affects our ability to generate electricity and where we're going to get that from. The top lines on that graph, the gray and the red, are fossil fuels. And those are still dominant. And of course, our burning of fossil fuels influences our climate, which influences river processes. Next, an IPCC International Panel on Climate Change plot about projections for future temperature change. And we can see a couple lines there with some shading around them. One is blue, one is sort of pink-orange. Those are different emission scenarios for the future. One would be sort of a lower emission scenario, one would be a higher, and it shows a group of model predictions, and it illustrates some of the uncertainty around the central tendencies on the lines, but generally by 2050, we're seeing on the order of 4 or 5 degree predicted increases Fahrenheit, and by 2100, even more than that. An important thing to remember about any of these global projections is that what happens locally is going to be different. And there are some areas of the globe where the projections are that climate change is going to have an even greater effect than others, and Montana happens to be one of those. Next, population. We are at around almost 8 billion now. Population is projected to go to about 11 billion by the middle of the century. And this, we can think about this issue locally, globally. People will place stresses on river systems. We'll need to feed more people. We'll need to provide energy for more people. And then lastly, river systems tie into many elements of sustainable development goals, and that's an issue we can think about, again, locally or globally. I also wanted to just provide a little more context about what I do and how I think about things. So broadly speaking, I already mentioned what I am as a geomorphologist, but some of the frameworks I use to think about rivers and landscapes. One of these is how sediment moves through watersheds and through landscapes and how connected different parts of the landscape are, whether that's between hill slopes, if there's landslides or fire or erosion on a hill slope, does that get into the channel network? How quickly? How does that move downstream? An issue that's very important for this group, how does sediment move between channels and their floodplains? So lateral connectivity. And then also that sort of headwaters to downstream element of how sediment moves through river systems. And it's very connected to thinking about how water moves through river systems, because the amount of water flowing through a landscape is one of the drivers that moves sediment around. But this question focusing on the sediment element of it is important for a range of things that people who are not geomorphologists care about, whether that's fish habitat, floodplain agriculture, bridges, other types of infrastructure, even where we get materials to build things. So sand is in high demand, and that is moved around the globe by river systems in many cases. And for geologists, the movement of sediment is also very important over a landscape evolution timescale in terms of shaping landscapes. So just a little conceptual diagram there that illustrates some of how we might think about that. And again, we can look at this sort of connectivity question globally. This is a global map of rivers in terms of how connected they are in multiple dimensions, whether that's influence of on the system by dams or levees, berms, etc. Broadly speaking, the cool or blue colors mean well-connected rivers, places like the Amazon River Basin. The warm or hot colors like the oranges and reds mean places with low connectivity of river systems. Okay, another important framework. Basic accounting and keeping track of how water and sediment moves. We use, as geomorphologists, what's referred to as a sediment budget. It's basically a tracking approach, just like any budget, but a way of understanding where sediment comes from, how it's moved, how it's stored in river systems at different time and space scales. And I connect these questions about how sediment moves through river systems to how rivers work, how they change, when they flood, when we can use information from the past to understand things about the future, and when we can't. And these are two just beautiful images that I really like that illustrate the dynamic nature of river systems and how they change over time. On the left is the Mississippi River. That's an illustration by a guy named Fisk, and just shows the nature of how that river moved before it was largely channelized and confined. That's a sort of traditional old school artistic depiction. On the right is a modern kind of technology that we use to understand landscapes, and that's LiDAR. So that's a LiDAR image, basically a laser-based system for mapping and measuring topography. That's a map of the Willamette River in Oregon, and it's an image that both of these images illustrate how much rivers have moved over time across their floodplains in ways that are not necessarily, sometimes are very clear and obvious, other times not. Okay, let's kind of talk broad scale about some ways that a geomorphologist like myself thinks about how climate changes can affect river processes. So the first big one is obviously in terms of hydrology and the amount of water that's moving down through river systems at different time scales. So average amounts of runoff. And then of course, the very important question of extreme events. We have a lot of reason to believe and observations that extreme events, whether those are floods or droughts, are becoming more common. We also think about the timing of river flows moving through river systems. And we'll come back to that specifically with respect to some of what's predicted to happen on the Clark Fork. Climate change would also be expected to influence the amount of sediment that's moving through river systems. Whereas we can come up with fairly solid and consistent predictions about climate change effect on the water side of things, the sediment side of things is a little more complicated. On the one hand, we can think about things like wildfire increasing in frequency and perhaps increasing erosion potential. But on the other hand, if we have reductions in precipitation, that could also reduce the amount of sediment that's moving off hill slopes into rivers. So a more complicated picture on the sediment side of things. In northern rivers like our region, ice formation and breakup of ice is another important process that shapes rivers, can cause hazards, flooding, infrastructure problems, and changes in temperature will very likely affect river ice dynamics in ways that we don't fully understand, but big picture, we would expect less frequency of river ice formation. Okay, water temperature, of course, an important one on the side of issues like fish habitat, which is fairly obvious, but is also an important one in terms of power production, because thermoelectric power plants, whether that's nuclear, anything requiring cooling, nuclear, coal, et cetera, require water. Warmer water leads to lower power production. So water temperature warming will affect energy systems in that way. We need to think about this in terms of what this means for management. Is it okay to look backwards at flow records and estimate the likelihood of certain size events occurring and manage based on that? We are frequently seeing that ideas like the 100-year flood don't mean that much anymore, given that they are based on past records under a different climate. There's this idea in hydrology of non-stationarity. Stationarity means that you have kind of steady conditions that are not changing over time, and you can use those to predict the future. But hydrologists are increasingly seeing that river systems and hydrology is not stationary. So that influences how we might think about resilience of roads, berms, other infrastructure. It influences how we might think about channel design for river restoration. And increasingly, we're needing to think about design and management to be more resilient to climate change. And I've also mentioned a few connections to energy systems already. Yes?
This is Brian. If I may interrupt,
Absolutely.
Ask a question.
Anytime.
So if you think using historic records is probably out of date, are you looking forward with predictions to design your projects now? How are you coming up with your streamflow management or your restoration projects if we can't use past history?
Yeah, well, I'll answer that. It's a great point, and I'll answer it more generally than how I use it, because I'm not in general designing projects. I'm an academic. I teach. I do research. I try to understand systems. This is not to say that the past is not useful and we shouldn't use the past. Absolutely, there's a lot of information about past flow records that we have to study and understand and continue using. But we also need to both interpret that differently in terms of just not assuming that's going to be what is going to be relevant moving forward. We need to combine those past records with projections about how hydrology, for example, is going to change in the future. And we're getting better at that type of modeling about hydrology. So if you think about sort of climate modeling, started with kind of global scale predictions of changes in temperature and precipitation. And we've gotten much better at downscaling those and coming up with regional predictions of, say, what will happen in Western Montana. And we've also gotten better at taking those climate predictions and putting them specifically into the framework of how flows in a river system might change. And I'll show an example of some of the projections for the Clark Fork. Anyone else want to jump in with questions at this point? Really, any time is totally fine with me for asking questions.
Quick question: how closely do you work with fisheries biologists?
Yeah.
That when you look at the.
No one can hear you.
Yeah, I can repeat the question. Yeah. So how much do I work with fisheries biologists? I work with biologists in general, sometimes fisheries, sometimes plant ecologists, sometimes people who think about bugs. I'm very interested in kind of the interaction between physical processes that I think about and ecosystem processes in rivers. And it varies depending on the project. I've had projects where there were close collaborations where we were trying to study how hydrology and geomorphology influence bull trout spawning, for example. There are some projects where I wish there had been more collaboration. For example, I worked on studying how the Clark Fork was affected by the Milltown Dam removal. And I can see Dave Schmetterling on the screen, or his name. And I know there were good studies going on of the fish effects of the dam removal. And, you know, I can make excuses about being busy and barriers between institutions and so on. Sometimes you just don't collaborate as much as you want to or should. But I'm always thinking about what the physical processes mean to humans and other organisms. Other questions? And the images on the screen, as you probably recognize, are what Lake Powell looks like these days. Okay. So projections. I'm going to start global and then come down to the Montana scale and then come down to the Clark Fork scale. And we can see a map-based version of predictions of how annual mean stream flow is going to change over time, over the next century or so. And the different lines on that, again, are related to different emission scenarios. RCP means relative concentration pathway. That's just an emission scenario in a model. So we can see on the map, some areas of the globe are going to actually increase in annual mean stream flow. And we can relate that to increases in precipitation. More polar areas, for example, are going to get wetter. And then some areas are going to get a lot drier. So the bluer, cooler colors on the map are the areas that will see more stream flow, and then the red and orange and yellow are those that'll receive less stream flow. In those graphs that you see, sometimes a region has both areas that are going to get a little bit wetter, a little bit drier. For example, in North America, the northern plains are an area that we've already seen evidence that they're getting wetter, and that's projected to increase, whereas places like the Southwest and California are expected to get drier. Okay. This one is the same type of projection using different emission scenarios for the globe, but in terms of water temperature. This one's consistent. We don't see areas of the globe that are predicted to have cooler water as a result of climate change. It's just the magnitude of the change, how deep those deep red versus orange versus yellow, those colors are. Okay, now let's bring this down to the level of Montana. So here we're not looking at projections. We're just looking at average climate data for a 30-year period. And we can see the red line is our maximum temperatures for different months of the year. The blue line is our minimum temperature. And the bar charts are precipitation. So if we were to look at August here, yeah, it won't show up on my plot, but the online version of it will show. We can see from the axis that the average August temperature during this time period was around 83 degrees or so. And just for comparison, here's a plot from this past August, and our average temperature was 92 degrees or so. 1 month does not make climate, that's weather, but we feel that we're having hot summers now. Going back a little farther, this is a plot from the Montana Climate Assessment, which came out a few years ago. And the first thing that the Montana Climate Assessment did was look backwards since about 1950 until 2015 to look at trends in different parts of Montana. So each of those letters on the right side of the screen is just a different region. We're in the Northwest region. And all of these show increases across the board, across all regions, whatever the parameter is for temperature, minimum, maximum, and average. We've all seen rises on average in the 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit range so far. That's not evenly distributed across the year. We see more warming during the winter and spring than during the summer. Okay. And then down here, these last couple words, high agreement, robust evidence. In this Montana climate assessment, they have a series of plots, some of which are past, some of which are future projections, and they try to provide some indication of the level of agreement between different data sources or models and the strength of the evidence for whether it's the past or the future projection. Okay, so that one's pretty straightforward. Next is the projections throughout the 21st century for temperature, and these again are divided up into different regions of Montana. So this is the same regions as we saw in the previous plot. And again, for all zones of Montana, all seasons, under different emission scenarios, we're projecting increases of approximately 4.5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. Okay. And that's on top of the 2 to 3 degrees warming that we've seen before. And as I mentioned earlier in the global plot, we're predicted to see even greater increases in temperature than global predictions. All right, so I'm gonna just move this so I can see my screen a little better. So on the top, whoops, we're seeing the projections for a sort of moderate emission scenario, and by mid-century here and late century on the top right, and then on the bottom are a high emission scenario for mid-century and late century.
So what temperature is that dark red?
The dark red is in the range of 6 degrees Fahrenheit increase. And then the lighter colors down here, the axis here is basically, this is 4.5, these kind of light tans, and then the darker red is around 6 on this graph, but down on this lower right graph, it has a different scale, where by end of the century, under a high emission scenario, we're up around 10 degrees increase. Now, I will say that there is, amidst the sort of gloom and doom and negative predictions, there is reason to believe that we will not hit those high emission scenarios based on the economics of solar, wind, and non-fossil fuel energies becoming much cheaper, and that is speeding adoption, whether that's in the US or elsewhere. All right, the next one will be about precipitation. Here it's a little bit more of a complicated picture, variations seasonally and variations across the state. So we are projected to see wetter conditions in winter, spring, and fall, drier conditions in the summer. And the greatest increases in precipitation, as I mentioned here, will be in the southern part of the state, and the biggest summer decreases are in central and southern Montana. Okay. Moderate agreement, moderate evidence. It's harder to predict what's going to happen precipitation-wise than temperature-wise. The dynamics of how much more water is likely to come out of a warmer climate are more complicated than just the straight basics of the greenhouse effect. You have more carbon in the atmosphere, you trap more heat, and we get warmer. Again, same idea here. The top two plots are for this, top two maps are for this moderate emission scenario, where the greener colors are an increase in precipitation and the browns are a decrease, where the top number is about 1.5 inches and the bottom again would be a decrease in 1.5 inches, but we don't see that on this plot. And then the bottom ones are the high emission scenario for mid-century and late century. Okay, now let's look at prediction in terms of stream flow for the Clark Fork at Thompson Falls. So let's start by just looking at the black line. The black line is the historical flow data at that site. And this is a hydrograph where on the x-axis, the bottom axis, we just have month of the year. Hydrologists do this thing where they start their year in October, which is why we start with October on the left side. That's a water year. And then we have discharge, or the flow rate moving through the river in cubic feet per second on the y-axis. All right, so the black line historical, we can see a few things. One is that snowmelt runoff that would result in the peak flows in early to mid-June, right, up here. And a fairly gradual rate of recession through the summer, where even through summer, we have a lot of water in the river. And that has effects on water temperature, effects on the amount of habitat available, and effects on things like hydroelectric production. All right, two emission scenarios. Again, you're getting used to these at this point. The RCP 4.5 is the moderate one. The higher emission scenario is the orange line there. Not a lot of difference between those in terms of projections for stream flow. So key changes we see, and we are already seeing, a shift to earlier peak runoff. Instead of early to mid-June, early May, maybe late April for these two scenarios. So that's a 5 to 6 week shift earlier in terms of peak runoff. We also see the peak predicted to be a little bit higher. And this goes back to the projections that the overall amount of water moving through the system may be greater, but there's less snowpack. It comes off more quickly, resulting in a slightly, we would call it flashier, slightly spikier hydrograph that rises higher earlier in the spring, but very significantly comes down earlier in the summer. So the summer flows are consistently lower into the fall, whereas the spring flows and the peak flow are higher than under current conditions. Okay. So this is a model, a group of models. One of the models that goes in here is called the VIC model, the Variable Infiltration Capacity Model, that takes climate projections and then routes them into a flow model through a river system. Yeah, question?
Yeah, running ecosystem models, you find in growing trees that they are basically the amount of tree growth, the success of the tree growing depends on winter snow. Snow itself is the key to putting the moisture there, and it grows till essentially that tree grows in the spring until the snow's all gone, it dries out, and then it shuts down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all these conifers can shut down for the summertime, which that's why they're here.
Yeah.
In the Northern Rockies. But when you think about that snowpack being the driver for trees, you know, how is this change in snowpack going to do on our forests?
Yeah. Well, it's a great point in terms of how climate and the type of precipitation that we have is going to affect forests, agriculture, plants in general. And there's sensitivity to the snowpack. There's also sensitivity to summer conditions in terms of how dry the air is. Basically, there's a term called the vapor pressure deficit, which basically indicates how hard the plants are having to work to get water. So both of those are really important and could cause shifts in the dominant species that we see in different parts of the landscape, the types of crops that farmers grow. I will leave it there though, because the sort of physiology of trees and how they react to moisture and plants is a little bit beyond sort of my area of expertise, but really important question. We will see changes not only to our rivers, but also to our forests as a result of these factors.
Do you see that affecting rangeland?
Yes, and we can think about, these plots looking at different parts of Montana. Some of these areas are certainly western Montana more forested, and eastern Montana more rangeland. So
Grazing.
yes.
I mean, we saw it last year in eastern Montana, how devastated that area was with hoppers and no water, and what it did to our ranchers that had to sell lots and lots of their herd because they couldn't feed them.
Yeah.
And I just wonder that swing, that correlation, you see the higher temperature and all of that sort of, I'm just kind of wondering how far that goes down the line.
Yeah, well, these are not to use a vague term, but these are complex systems that have a lot of feedbacks that are hard to predict. And, we have years where we think things are going well. We have good snowpack, and then there's a flash drought. It just stops and gets hot, and the forests start to burn, and the fields start to wither, and so on. So all of these predictions are kind of more on averages, but what actually often affects people and landscapes is events, the extremes, and those are even harder to predict, other than general predictions that the extremes are likely to become even more extreme, whether it's on the drought or flood side of things. All right. Let's bring this around, continue bringing it around to the Clark Fork. And coming into this, I wasn't sure kind of who you had heard from in terms of sort of background on hydrology, channel migration, et cetera. Elena told me that you did hear from Karen Boyd a while back, so that's great. She does excellent work. Here is a plot of the peak flows on the Clark Fork at the above Missoula gauge. And this goes back to 1908, and we can see our big, tall first line there on the left side of the graph. That's the 1908 flood, where we had 48,000 cubic feet per second, and that's estimated to be a, say, 1 in 500 year event. We haven't seen anything close to that since then. I've got lines showing what would be considered the 4% annual exceedance probability flow, which is about 32,000 CFS. We just almost got to that in 2018. We could also think about that as a 25-year recurrence interval flood event. Two ways of thinking about probability. But 4% would say in any given year, there's a 4% chance of a flood that size or larger, or 10%. That one's been exceeded more frequently. But the kind of bottom line on this plot is we have not seen big floods on the Clark Fork since the 1908 event. And during 2018 and during 2011, there was a lot of snow in the mountains. And if it had warmed up differently and come off differently, it could have resulted in a much bigger event than we had. And that, of course, has implications for how the channel moves, how much it inundates floodplains, how much sediment it moves, and what this means for things like management of a place like Smurfit-Stone. All right. So I've got a few plots, a few images from Karen's report. So again, here's the 2018 flood, a approximately 25-year recurrence interval event that, because of the berms at this site, was not overtopped in any significant way, but it's a good reminder of some of the risks on a river system like this. And Karen, I'm not going to try and present Karen's work, but she also has done some nice documentation of points of vulnerability, how much the river has moved in different parts of the Clark Fork Basin, whether it's because of this event or otherwise. And for those of you who haven't seen her work, just a nice summary plot on the left would be a relative elevation modeling, basically how much higher above the base flow channel are different parts of the floodplain, where the cooler blue colors are closer in elevation to the channel, and the warmer colors are higher. And this is also showing the CMZ, or channel migration zone, which is an amalgam of different ways of mapping of where the channel has been in sort of documented history, where it might go because of avulsions, where it jumps path, and a way of thinking about risk of flooding and of channel change that is different than the standard approach that is used for insurance purposes, which is just based on water elevation and mapping, say, the 100-year floodplain. We know that rivers can move and affect areas that are much higher than the 100-year floodplain. And the CMZ approach nicely illustrates that. Okay, and just one more map of that site from Karen. I'm going to be expecting that there are questions about this, and I'm going to be happy to come back to that. But I also want to kind of zoom back out again and talk about vulnerability and unanticipated events and resilience. So we see images of two significant flooding events this summer. On the left, ongoing for months in Pakistan. Many people killed, huge effects on their society. I think the death toll there is something like 1,100 at this point, and swaths across the country being affected by intensified monsoons in a very vulnerable place. On the right, we see the Gardner River through Gardner Canyon, and in the foreground there is the remnants of the road that's been washed out. Right here. And I have been fortunate to be able to get involved in work in Yellowstone this summer, studying the effects of those floods. The Park Service is very keenly interested in trying to look forward into the future of, should we put a road back into a place like this? How can we build to be resilient to future extremes when we recognize that the hydrology of the past may not be the hydrology of the future? But they don't necessarily have simple solutions, because there's places on the hill slope that would be away from the channel that are susceptible to landslides in a kind of post-glacial, highly erodible landscape, all in the context of severe pressure to reestablish connectivity, another type of connectivity with the surrounding communities. So why don't I leave it there and open it up for questions?
you see if there's questions on the bottom of your screen.
Let's see.
Stop
Yep. So feel free to unmute and ask questions, put them in the chat.
Promise not to touch your photos.
All right, no questions? I was sure there would be some.
I think the Yellowstone events are a nice example of how the sort of unanticipated event is actually maybe not all that unusual. I mean, one thing we're trying to do in Yellowstone is think about how big were these events really in a historical context. And yeah, they're big floods, but not something that you couldn't have predicted in a certain sense. I can remember hearing presentations by Karen Boyd 10 years ago about the Yellowstone River, about how susceptible it was going to be to migration in the next big flood. And then you see the videos of the house washing off the cliff and floating downstream, and, you know, not all that hard to foresee in a sense. Dave, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for presenting. You know, you mentioned, so regarding the berms at the site, you'd mentioned, you know, there's no risk to overtopping them. And that's, you know, the overtopping of the berms really hasn't been that big of a concern from the CAG and others. It's mainly been the channel migration and the, you know, and those berms getting eroded and the channel, you know, migrating to its former floodplain. And just wanted to see if you could speak to that briefly. And then also just within the context of climate resiliency, you know, how those berms limit the ability of the Clark Fork and that floodplain to be resilient to future climate models. That'd be really helpful.
Yeah, great points. So the engineering of berms or other structures is based on this idea of what can we build that won't be overtopped. And again, going back to the Yellowstone Gardner Canyon example, the road was not washed out because it was overtopped. It was washed out because it was undercut. And the undercutting, whether it's of a berm or of a road or a hill slope, is harder to predict and harder to harden against. So the fact that this group is more concerned about that is certainly appropriate. In terms of resilience in the future, floodplain channel connectivity is one of the fundamental elements of a healthy river system for fish, for sediment exchange, for carbon. Another part of river systems that are important in the climate system is that they store carbon. And that largely happens on their floodplain. So disconnecting rivers from their floodplains and trying to maintain that into the future through continued inputs of money and maintenance and engineering, I understand there are situations and contexts where that may well be the right approach for society, but there are also situations where building and thinking about a river system that is more climate resilient is going to involve creating and reestablishing connectivity, not continuing to limit it. And as a related sort of aside, I've been involved in some studies of what's effective in river restoration, what works. We've spent billions of dollars globally on restoring rivers. And the sort of classic approach is we go to a reach and we do some re-engineering. Mixed results, but there is very, very clear evidence that reestablishing connectivity whether it's by moving levees back or removing culverts or dams, is the most effective approach to creating healthy rivers. Elena.
So, in essence, if the berms aren't removed, how might they increase the risks or push the geomorphological changes as a function of climate change downstream or upstream?
Yeah. So leaving berms or other structures that constrain rivers, we can kind of broaden the question a little bit. You know, what are the broader effects of that? As a river is moving downstream through its channel network, it is expending energy. And that energy will go into eroding the bed, eroding the bank, carrying sediment in the river system. And often because of structures, whether it's berms on this part of the river or riprap or the levees in Missoula, those are just transferring the river's dissipation or expenditure of that energy to somewhere else. So by hardening rivers and constraining them and disconnecting them from floodplains, we're essentially moving the problem elsewhere, usually downstream. There are some situations where if we harden and create a constriction, we might sort of limit the conveyance of floods downstream in ways that kind of cause water to back up a little bit more upstream. But broadly speaking, in terms of the energy transfer, it might be to, you know, the next meander bend downstream or even further down the system.
Any other further questions?
You know, there was one question that EPA asked at our meeting last week was, what do you think about this site in general as a hazardous material repository? And my view, for two reasons: a potential flooding risk and also the high groundwater table. Those two things make it kind of a dicey spot. We can find much better spots for repositories. And so I was wondering if
Dr. Wilcox had an opinion on that.
Yeah, I was gonna just share my screen again to pull up the presentation. All right. So one thing that's interesting about this section of river, and not unique to this section of river, we see this in a lot of rivers in western Montana and mountain landscapes, is on one side of the river you've got mountains, and on the other side you've got floodplain. And for reasons that we do not fully understand, often when the river is flowing up against the mountain side of the valley, it kind of gets stuck there. It just stays there for longer than you might predict from basic principles of rivers want to move and they want to meander. But the space that they have to meander is in one direction, and they're not going to get hung up on that mountain front indefinitely, whether it's, you know, a log jam or an extra large event. They do have susceptibility to movement and in one direction. They're not going to erode out in general into the bedrock of the mountainsides. They're going to be more likely to go towards their floodplain. So that's a problematic kind of aspect of this site in terms of long-term resilience to large events, essentially.
So let me understand, you're saying Probably not a good place for a depository. 'Cause
Well, I mean, if I was going to go and think about where to put stuff starting from scratch, would I pick a river floodplain like this with a clear evidence of movement over a longer time frame, but not over a recent time frame in a river system that we have reason to believe is going to become more susceptible to extremes in the future? No. But I also recognize that these are really tough problems of where to put our legacy of pollution. You know, I mean, Milltown, we had the same issue.
Yeah.
You dig it out, where are you going to move it? Are you going to move it back to Anaconda? Are you going to put it in Bandman Flats? Are you going to leave it in place? It's very easy to just say, don't do this. But we also need to say, do this instead.
Mhm.
And I have not looked at this system to say, no, this is where it should go. Okay. It's easy to critique from the ivory tower and say, no, it's a river system, it's a floodplain, it's going to erode eventually. But it doesn't mean the material is going to go away. We got to figure out what to do with this and other problems.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. And that gives us a way forward. We have to have answers to start with for the basics, and then add on to that. And that's exactly where we want to go. Does that answer your question, Bruce?
Yep.
Excellent. Are there any other questions? And I can't see the hand up, so just shout out.
Maybe, are there any other lessons for this group of locally interested citizens from Milltown to carry forward?
It's a great question.
Oh, from Milltown.
Or elsewhere. There's other places too. Yeah, we can lean on all your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, whether it's, we don't have to look far in the news to sort of see that we need to manage and anticipate for extreme events. And, you know, that was one of the motivations of removing Milltown, was trying to eliminate the potential of something really bad happening there. And there were some high flows that moved some contaminated sediment downstream and caused some short-term impacts, but long-term, I mean, long-term from a management scale, meaning 14 years later, not from a geologic time scale, it's been a success, and that is a more resilient section of river now to whatever comes down the Clark Fork in the future, whether that's unraveling of more contaminants upstream in the Deer Lodge Valley or floods, et cetera. So in some sense, that provides an example of sort of anticipating and restoring towards a more kind of resilient type of river system that has connected channels and floodplains and so on. Another lesson from that is that, like I alluded to earlier, you know, we gotta figure out what to do with the contaminants and the other legacies that are out there, and that needs to be a combined scientific and technical process, but also very much of a social, transparent communication process.
Okay. Anybody in this group have questions? We're all questioned out? Yes. Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much.
All right.
So much.
Thank you. Well, feel free to contact me. My email address is there, and then I just have a link on the screen there to
Can you send your slides to
time lapse in Google Earth if you want to go look at the Clark Fork at Smurfit and see how it's changed over the last 40 years.
Can you send your presentation?
Yes, I can.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Should I send it to Jen?
Yes,
Harrington?
and Jen, and she'll get it.
Yeah, she'll send it to Connie and Bruce.
All right. Well, thanks for the invite.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right.
If you need any more ideas for your students to research, we're open for it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Brian. Yep. All right.
I noticed in Karen's voice.
All right. I see no blank or new chats.
That was fun to see.
We're down to ongoing tasks and suggestions. Oh, wait a minute.
Ronnie's.
Are we going to do an EPA update?
Elena, do you want to read the email that Ally sent regarding the update? Do you have it on your phone?
Yeah, I can do that.
Maybe we should
Okay.
close the presentation first.
No, that's the one that Dana sent. Do you want me to read what Dana sent, or do you want me to read what Ally sent?
Oh, I didn't know that Dana sent anything.
Bruce?
All right. Stand by, folks. We have a couple of items coming up. As soon as I close the USB, we're done.
Okay.
All right. Elena, you're going to do a presentation?
Am I?
Yeah.
Okay, sure, yeah.
There you go.
The emails that are updates.
Let me read you an email to my phone. I wasn't prepared.
Whoops, sorry.
Do you want me to share the PDF?
So yeah, I think Bruce is, it's pretty long. I think you're welcome. That'd be great to share the PDF with people.
Just share it. Yeah, we can just share it. That's fine.
Okay.
We'll just send it and share it.
Otherwise, I mean, essentially, the commissioners reached out to Ally to ask what was going on at the site, and they said the property owners were moving the rail line.
Yeah.
This time, EPA and DEQ are working to understand what environmental conditions are present surrounding the rail lines. The landowner's activity in no way hinders the EPA's circular process. That is, if we ultimately issue a decision document that calls for contaminated materials to be consolidated on-site or moved off-site, the absence of a spur will not preclude us from ensuring that the materials are moved or consolidated. It's the agency's understanding that the landowner is removing the rail tracks and ties, but is not moving or spreading soil. Therefore, there is no substantive change in the characteristics of the nature and extent of the contamination. Our understanding is that construction debris is currently being hauled off-site to a municipal landfill in Helena, and railroad ties and lines are being sold to third parties. The landowner is still obligated to comply with applicable regulations.
Okay.
EPA and DEQ are working with the landowner to ensure if any activity results in signs of new contamination or exacerbation of existing contamination, that it would be addressed appropriately. So that's an email in response to a question the commissioners had about what was occurring. And, at Milltown, a rail spur was used to remove contaminated sediment off-site. So we were just asking whether that precluded that or not, and then what was happening with the stuff. Because, Jerry, there's a lot going on there. So
And it just continues. It's, I don't know if anybody's driven by, but there's a lot of activity out there, and it's getting more businesses. There's a question. Oh, David, sorry. Okay, yeah,
Are we done?
I think so.
I just wanted to mention that both Ollie and Dana apologized for not being able to be here tonight. They both had conflicts in their schedules,
So they'll be here next
and
month.
they promised to be here next month.
And we'll get this going next month. We'll figure that out.
All right. So
And that's,
next month we'll be on a bigger screen.
yeah,
Excellent. So now we have an update on Smurfit-Stone. I've noticed lots of new businesses, lots of activity.
right. We had asked Dana at our last meeting to come to this meeting with a fairly substantial update on the site, community involvement plan. And so I think it's time to revisit him giving a presentation. It's our understanding that there's another person that's going to be involved as a kind of a community involvement coordinator, and I'm guessing that that person, whoever, I think his name is Al, I don't recall his last name, would be here next month. So I guess we can probably anticipate that.
All right, that would be an agenda item, I suppose.
And then Brian, are you gonna hear by then about the, no, okay. Okay,
Won't be till November.
November, okay.
And that's their stated timeline, so it might not even be that.
Okay.
Who are we talking about?
The grant.
The grant.
So we applied with some other people for a America's Beautiful grant to actually look at doing the additional studies in the assessment plan and doing the natural resource damage assessment.
Excellent. And they'll be here next month to talk about that?
No, we won't hear about that grant
Till
until
November.
at least November and not later, and maybe later.
Mhm. So we'll have other agenda items as the month goes on, I'm sure.
Excellent.
It always happens.
It does. All right, so we're just about done. We still have pretty much everybody on board. I've always been told to try and learn something every day. And if I don't make a mistake, I haven't learned anything. So now I know that Dr. Andrew Wilcox is a geoscience person. And now I guess I have to be embarrassed.
Not.
So possible agenda items next month. We have community involvement plan.
Just an
And
update,
Dana?
a pretty extensive update from Dana. We haven't heard from Dana as far as updates go, and I think we're a little bit overdue.
Okay.
So that would be a great thing to start off our fourth quarter with, a pretty extensive update. We've had a summer of a lot of activity out at the mill, and
It would be good.
it would be good. There's some timelines that are coming up, and I think just going over the timelines and managing expectations of what those timelines look like would be good.
All right, you'll send a note to Dana with
Yeah.
that. All right, very good. And if there's any other suggestions for agenda items, contact Jen Harrington or Bruce Sims with your ideas, your thoughts. Well, Jerry, you can contact Jerry too.
Yep.
Bruce and Jen are much better. Jerry's always busy. All right. Tag grant, are we still online with that? All right, we'll have to get that on the agenda one of these days. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're a little.
One thing, if you have a second.
Sure, you want to go for it?
Yeah. So I shared. The trustees prepared a response to comments. It's not an all-inclusive response to comments, but kind of addressed a lot of them. Of the comments that were submitted on the draft natural resource damage assessment plan. Bruce is going to share a link to those, so I would encourage you to have a look at them. I also, in that response to everybody that submitted comments, encouraged them to participate in the CAG meeting. So hopefully you'll get some more calls and get some more people showing up.
Great.
All right. Couple of other items. Bruce, did you get everybody's name? That was.
I think so.
Excellent, excellent. So, if you tried. For those folks who are attending the meeting in person, the door to get into the junior high commons is on the west end of the building. So the west parking lot, west end. And hopefully we'll be here early enough to open doors so you can come on in. Otherwise, it's a convoluted trail to get here from the gym doors. So next month, it will be October 6th, 2022 will be our next meeting, 1800 here in the Commons, as well as there'll be a tag or a Zoom meeting as well, right?
Yep.
Excellent.
Did we have any suggestions for meeting topics next month? I know EPA is going to give us an update.
Yeah.
Are there any other topics that anybody has that they'd like us to pursue? All right.
All right. Jerry, anything else?
No,
For the
thanks,
good of the order?
everybody.
Jen, is there anything else from you? Nothing from Jen. All right. Then I think we're going to go ahead and close this meeting down. I want to thank everybody for participating. It's very appreciated. And again, thank Dr. Andrew Wilcox for his presentation. It was very good and interesting presentation. So until next month, thank you.